Can people hear?
Yeah, you are on mute now.
Oh, this is fantastic. And thank you. Thank you to our panelists. We turn to. Is that now? Is the.
We have some sound issues, I think.
Yeah, that's what.
The control room.
Yes.
Yes, I think the control room, yeah. A very interesting discussion on economic and social transformation, where we are going to share the experience of different geographies. I think all the decision makers and experts in the world are currently asking one simple question: what is going to change after the COVID-19 crisis? We all know that change is not linear, and change could go in different directions. If I want to use the metaphor of or medical language, I would say change is something that could be contagious and could mutate. And therefore, for that, it's very important to have a regional perspective and compare experience. And I don't think that there is best than the panel we have today to discuss that. We will start with Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the fund, who has witnessed, experienced, and led several changes in different institutions and in different geographies. Kristalina will give us an introductory remark, and then we move to four outstanding speakers. First, Minouche Shafik, Director of London School of Economics, Erik Berglöf, Chief Economist of AIIB, Mauricio Cárdenas, former Minister of Finance of Colombia and currently visiting professor at Columbia University, and Marwan Muasher, former Jordan Deputy Prime Minister and Vice President for Studies at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We have 1 hour discussion. Our speakers will exchange their experience, views about and their perspective on change and transformation. And my colleague Alejandro will have the difficult task at the end to sum up the discussion and get the takeaways of what I'm sure will be a very interesting and rich discussion. Without any further ado, let me welcome our Managing Director, who yesterday, in fact, with her curtain raiser speech, opened the spring meetings, and I'm sure that she was extremely busy yesterday and today, and we are thankful for her time early this morning. Kristalina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jihad, and let me wholeheartedly thank the panelists who are joining us for this discussion. I am very eagerly waiting to hear what they have to say. Since you mentioned that I have firsthand experience in transition, it brought memories in 91, 30 years ago this year. I was a Fulbright Fellow at MIT, teaching a class on economies in transition. That was the year of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And little did I know how long this transition is going to take, that it would be decades, not months and years. Actually, the toughest part came for my own country in the mid-90s, when hyperinflation, actually resistance to change, led to very bad consequences. Hyperinflation melted down to nothing my mother's savings, And I have memories of standing in line early in the morning, 4 o'clock, to buy milk. And that is such a profoundly strong memory and deep understanding that transformations are desirable when they lead to good policies, but they're complex and they can be painful. That macro decisions have micro consequences and they have to be understood, and the negative of them, to the extent possible, mitigated so there can be societal support for change that brings these desirable gains for a country, for a community, and for a family. I know that we are now at the boundaries of another transformation. COVID is pressing us, and it is so very important that what comes on the other side is better and it is inclusive. Minouche wrote a fantastic book. I'm sure we would hear from her on what the social compact can deliver for everyone. The alternative of trying to not change is not very attractive, because we remember before the COVID crisis hit, we were not in the best of places. I vividly recall my first speech as a managing director in the months before the pandemic. What did I talk about? Low productivity, anemic growth, inequalities going up, and a looming climate crisis. None of these things have gone away. So we have absolutely an obligation to look at what policies can do to bring us to a more inclusive, greener, resilient, digital world with as little divergence as possible. And yet what we are seeing right now is a growing divergence within countries and across countries. What we can do, the panel would tell us, based on looking at what has worked in the past in transformations that have been going on, and actually none of them is entirely and totally and fully completed. Central and Eastern Europe, many countries overhauled their institutional economic frameworks. They became integrated into Europe and into the world economy. And yet there are some lingering issues in some of these countries. Latin America, democratization in the 90s, it was the foundation for reforms in a number of countries. Middle East and North Africa, we had the Arab uprisings in 2011. What has worked, what has not? And that is what we would hear from the panel, so we can draw the right conclusions for what next. Very important for the countries, very important for us at the IMF, so we can do our job well. And with this, I'm all ears. Thank you.
Kristalina, thank you very much for these introductory remarks. Let me now turn to Minouche, and also to congratulate you on your new book, What We Owe Each Other. I think already it's making the buzz. And let me go again to what the managing director has shared as a personal and also as professional experience. Transformation could be bring good things, or also could be challenging, could face sudden stop. And therefore we have different experiences that different geographies have faced. From Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall to Latin America, as Kristalina was saying, and Middle East. If you want to a bit give the 2-3 key important elements that could make this process reaching a lasting change and a positive change, what would be, especially in this new environment where we are facing one tremendous shock that our civilization, our countries are facing. What are the lessons that one could draw on, or the issues that we need to give more attention to? Minouche.
I would identify three big factors that determine whether these transformations are successful or not. The first is that there's actually a change in political power. And it's interesting to think about transformations where not much really changed politically. And one thinks of, the Arab Spring, where with one exception, actually the old elites just recycled and rebranded themselves, and there wasn't much change in political power. But in countries where there is a genuine change, as occurred in many countries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe and the Baltics, there's more likelihood. Second, I'd say what the institutions in countries are like. I think it's interesting that Tunisia, for example, which had a long tradition of civil society, trade unions, a relatively free press, those other institutions held government to account and demanded reforms and change. And in country, it's not surprising that anti-reformist political leaders attack those institutions and try and disempower the free media, parliamentary institutions, and civil society. So I think effective institutions are a key. And I think the third thing I'd say is good ideas. Transformations like the New Deal after the Great Depression came about because there were some really new and interesting ideas about how we could organize our societies and our economies differently. And that's, to be honest, part of the reason why I wrote this book, What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract, in hopes that, I've seen this in many, many countries. You get a political window of opportunity that opens up in a crisis. And whatever good ideas are lying around are the ones that people grab. So I think it's very important, like events like this, where good ideas are put out there so that they might be grabbed in a moment of opportunity.
Thank you very much. Institutions, thinkers, trust are three key dimensions. Let me test those three dimensions with Marwan. Marwan, you are a thinker, you are an actor, and you are an observer. And you were among those who hoped that the transition that started in 2011 would lead to what maybe we saw in different experiences. Change could mutate in a good or a bad directions. What explains the difference between, from your standpoint, those different experiences? Is an issue of design, it's an issue of leadership, is it an issue of maturity, the population? Is it also an issue of the partners who are helping those countries in this transition? Marwan.
Thank you, Jihad. Let me start by saying that the root causes for the Arab uprisings are all the same, regardless of the differences in each Arab country. The root causes are the lack of good governance and the lack of economic opportunity. Now, how do we move forward has been varied according to the, to each Arab country. I cannot reinforce enough what Kristalina has said, that transformations are complex, are lengthy, are not linear, and they are going to take a long time. So no one should really judge the Arab uprisings, but what has happened in a short 10 years. This is a process of transformation that might take decades, 30, 40, 50 years. That's my first point. The second point is, if we look at how Arab countries have dealt with the Arab uprisings, the one exception that Minouche talked about, Tunisia, is because of new social contracts. I'm so excited about Minouche's new book, because that is something that, institutions, including the World Bank, IMF, and other institutions, have not focused on until recently. Social contracts are becoming a necessity, not a luxury. And in Tunisia, which is not out of the wood by any means, economically or security-wise, but what the Tunisians have understood, to the exception maybe of all other Arab countries, is that the first order of business is to agree on a new social contract. And they have done so in a very difficult manner, but they have achieved a new constitution that laid the ground for what future Tunisians want for themselves. The rest is going to come, but it's not going to come in 5 or 6 or even 10 years. All other Arab countries have not, or either not understood it or were not willing to engage in new social contracts. So we have the Gulf countries who have tried to pour money literally on the problem. Just give people more money and expect that things will, stabilize without changing the political structure. That worked for a while until both the decline in oil prices in 2014 and COVID-19, which has meant that money that coming out of oil was no longer possible. There are other countries that that where outside forces slowed down the process of change. Okay, outside forces were not the cause of the Arab uprisings in these countries like Syria, Libya, or Yemen, but there definitely outside forces made or played a role in affecting the course of these uprisings in these countries. And then there are countries like Egypt who have tried, the security approach, the deep state approach, maintain social peace through security means. And, these work for a while, but they are not able to address the root causes of the problem. And that is why Arab uprisings are going to continue to happen. We've seen wave 2 in Algeria, in Sudan, in Iraq, in Lebanon. And in my view, as long as the root causes of the problem are not addressed and are not addressed primarily and foremost through new social contracts, we're going to see third and fourth and fifth waves of the Arab uprisings.
Thank you very much, Marwan. Let me turn to Mauricio and borrow on what Marwan just said. The root cause of all these uprisings is economic aspirations. Latin America is a place where economy has improved, if you look at the indicators over the last 3 decades. And yet we saw a few years ago, 2018, 2019, some social unrest and uprising. How one should draw the right balance between economic aspirations and social dimensions, and is an equilibrium that is required here, or it's a complementarity that was missed? What could you tell us about that?
Well, thank you. And I'm delighted to be in this panel. And I also thank you for organizing this, because we're still in the midst of this pandemic, overloaded with problems and issues. Latin America, again, is in a very difficult situation. Think of Brazil, the number of cases now higher than ever. The vaccine rollout for the majority of countries, with the exception of Chile, has been quite problematic. But it's good to have this opportunity to think about the future and to think if and how can we make sure that this pandemic becomes an opportunity for change, and that this is a World War II moment or an opportunity for a renewed Latin America, something that will be changed for the good. So prior to the pandemic, as Kristalina was saying, we were in a situation where progress in a number of fronts, economic growth, social progress, had stagnated after 2 decades of success. So the initial conditions were those of a region with lots of emerging social unrest, people unhappy, and unhappy primarily because we had made a lot of progress. People had moved into the middle class, but they did not feel secure in the middle class. They were not consolidated, and there was the fear of returning to poverty. Well, the bad news is that that fear actually took place because of the pandemic. So what we're seeing is an increase in the numbers of people under poverty and a significant reversal in inequality. So that's the initial condition that we have to consider when we think about the change that we need to introduce. Because certainly this is an opportunity for change. This is an opportunity to rewrite constitutions, to agree on a new social contract, to change the way we allocate government expenditures. And if you ask me, what is the necessary condition for this to happen, is really to address the inequality issue. Because that was really what triggered the unrest, and it could be the source of future populisms in the region that will not improve things, will actually worsen things. So how to do that? In one very important way is the new social compact or social contract. Some countries are in the process of writing new constitutions. That's the case of Chile. In other cases, it's about prioritization. I think we have too many objectives, and that's part of the problem. I think World War II was an opportunity for change, and new institutions were built, more resources were channeled for the reconstruction, and it was primarily the goal of growth. It was a GDP growth. Now we have a lot of objectives. So we have to narrow those objectives a bit. And my preference would be to focus on social cohesion, and focus on the reduction of inequality, bring more opportunity, and that will really allow for other good things to happen down the road. But we should put that at the center of the strategies for the post-pandemic recovery.
Thank you very much. You raised very important issues. We will come back to that. Let me now turn to Erik. Erik, you are far from Europe, but I want to bring you back to Europe. Europe is being considered as the role model, as the benchmark for orderly, forward-looking and positive transformation back in 1990s. What could Europe teach other transformations, and how do you see Europe in 2021 after this big shock of the COVID-19 in terms of inclusion, in terms of opportunities for its citizens? Erik.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So the panel is economic and social transformation. I actually think the answer to the question is in the missing piece, the political transformation. And you know, I remember I was at the EBRD at the time of the Arab awakening, and we were asked to become active in North Africa and the Middle East. And it was, of course, an incredible excitement about the opportunity to transfer our experience from Central Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union to this new region. But I at the time knew essentially nothing about North Africa and the Middle East. I had visited, but never really taken time to understand it. But so I consulted someone that will be familiar to all of you, which was Masoud Ahmed, and he was then as you know, the director of the Middle East department at the IMF, and we worked very closely, and he taught me a lot in that process, and we had a lot of ideas for what we could do. In the end, it turned out for the IMF to be very difficult. It was very difficult to participate in the kind of events we were planning. But he did one thing that I took away. He did organize a course in political economy for all the members of the Middle East department, which I think was at that time, at least for the IMF, quite an unusual thing. But what we did at the EBRD at the time was to organize something called a transition to transition. And so we brought together senior policymakers, typically for prime minister, deputy prime ministers from Eastern Europe. At the time, there was a lot of interest actually in many countries to be part. So Poland and Hungary and others at that point, you know, really wanted to share their development experience, and they were willing to come. And then we also brought senior sector specialists and so on in some areas we thought were important. And what really stood out from that, one is this richness of comparing transitions and how much you can learn from that. But what really struck me, and it goes to the topic that, you know, it's the topic of Minouche's book, but the topics that have been brought up by everyone is the inclusion. Because what really hit you when you come from Central European, Eastern European experience is the extent of exclusion in some of these, particularly of women, of course, but also in many cases for other reasons as well. And I can tell you that for EBRD, it was like before and after, because after that, inclusion has become something absolutely central to what the EBRD does, and it was very much came out of that experience. But you also learned the strengths of the entrenched interests, and you know, you have mentioned some of those in the previous interventions. But it was also, as Minouche brought out, the power of these civil society organizations in Tunisia. And of course, you know, follow Tunisia very closely. I teach a course at LSE now, and we've had the last two lessons have been on Tunisia and Ukraine. And what really stands out is, of course, the fantastic dialogue of democracy that has been established, but at the same time, the lack of economic reforms, and there's no architecture for bringing economic reform into that country, and it's something that is, to me, very worrying. So if I go back to Central and Eastern Europe, again, I think it's really about the political transformation that makes it stand out. First of all, let's make it clear that this is a tremendous success. So, you know, there has been some backtracking, but it is, you know, if you look at economic well-being, life satisfaction, all those things have improved tremendously. We might forget that at times. But what we have seen in terms of backtracking and political challenges, they are very real, and we have reasons to be worried about them. But we should also recognize that these countries are not alone in facing these challenges. And we know them from other emerging countries. We know them from Western Europe. We know them from the United States. And it's this lack of inclusion and a lack of recognition of inclusion, both in economic and social sense. And we need to take those very seriously. And that's something that I take away from you know, the economic and social transformation and political transformation. They are very much connected, and that's the connection between what, you know, Minouche has talked about in her book on the social contract. And I think that is, to me, the fundamental lesson from comparing these transitions.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the speakers for laying the ground on and shedding light on important issues. Please feel free if you want to interject or if you want to have a comment on the comments that came before, will be most welcome. The only thing you need to do is to unmute and take the floor. This is also Kristalina. Please, if you have any comment, please do. Building on what Erik just said, I want to return to Marwan. Political transformation, inclusion, and power of civil society requires to create a dialogue. Not all countries have the platform for that. You have conducted a dialogue at some point in time when you were Deputy Prime Minister, when you did the national agenda for Jordan. What are the ingredients for a success in a dialogue, and what are the challenges that one could face when you want to have a broad consultation with different stakeholders in the society?
Yes, we need to understand that the old tools of keeping social peace in the Arab world are being today severely challenged. The carrot of financial resources brought about by oil and the stick of the use of security to keep people quiet. These tools after 2011 and after 2014, and especially now because of COVID-19, these tools are sort of diminished. And governments can no longer keep social peace through using these tools. So what are the new tools that are necessary? Inclusion on an equal footing comes at the top of these tools. It's not just inclusion. I like what Erik said, inclusion in a political and in a social sense. It has to be inclusion on an equal footing. This is what we tried in Jordan to do, because to move politically from exclusion to inclusion, from authoritarianism to diversity, to move economically from a rentier and patronage system to a merit and productive system, to move societally from a society that did not treat its citizens equally, whether they are men or women, Christians or Muslims, conservative or liberal, to a society that treats all of its citizens on an equal footing, requires a national dialogue that is serious, not a nominal process where you bring in all components of society to agree on what kind of a future do they want for their country. This is something that we attempted in Jordan, and we did come up with a document that really, in my view, accurately represented the aspirations of all components of Jordanian society. The problem that we faced was the political will was not there. The political will to change a system that moves from authoritarianism to diversity, that moves from patronage to productivity, that moves societally to put everybody on an equal footing, was just not there. And therefore, the old guard in my country were successful, very successful at really killing the initiative the moment it saw the light. And so without the political will in countries, inclusion can take place, dialogue can take place at a societal level, but implementation is going to take much more time. Maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, but I am at least hoping that COVID-19 might play a positive factor in this. Because look, in the past in the Arab world, if we faced an economic problem, we could always look to the Gulf to bail us out. Today, no country can bail you out. Each country is out for its own. And today we are competing for international funds with the whole world who needs to borrow in order to sustain itself. So I'm hoping that at least these economic crises might trigger people to do the right thing and start a serious national dialogue. We have not seen that yet, I must admit, neither in Jordan nor in most of the Arab world. But I'm still hoping that we can make the best out of the economic crisis we see ourselves in today.
Thank you very much. You are, in fact, giving me the right transition, because this discussion today is about shaping up the future. And COVID-19 is definitely a shock that would accelerate trends and would also disrupt some of the old practices. And let me go back to you, Minouche. Several speakers mentioned your book about renewing a social contract, social compact, whatever. But I think the title of your book is What We Owe Each Other, is something that is calling for a collective action, a mutual action of different stakeholders that maybe have conflicting objectives. And therefore, my question to you is, after what we have listened to, let me move into what are the lessons and the advice that after writing this book, if you want to talk to your young students, you would say, who will be leading, in fact, the next transformation? What you would tell them, those who are coming to LSE from Latin America, from the Middle East, from Europe, or even from different geographies where we're not seeing today on the radar of transformation, but could be also places and scenes for transformations.
Well, I think I would agree with the sentiment that COVID provides an opportunity. If you look at one of those political windows of opportunities that I've described, I saw a very interesting poll in 24 countries where they asked people, how do you feel after? They interviewed people before COVID and after. And after COVID, people are angry and they feel let down. But they also feel that they value equality more and community and solidarity after being deprived of human contact for so long. So I think there is a window of opportunity. What are the answers? I think I think there are two huge issues. One is that people feel that the current social contract does not provide them security, nor does it provide them with opportunity. What do I mean by that? On security, I think every country in the world can now afford to provide a minimum below which no one goes. In poor countries, it's through cash transfer schemes invented in Latin America, spreading across the Middle East and Africa and Asia. Those minimum floors is what we need to provide security, not guaranteed public sector jobs like in the Middle East, which was the historical way the state provided you with security. So a minimum floor below which no one can go. Second, I would also say security in terms of jobs. More and more workers, who suffered the most? Those who are on precarious work and in the informal sector. That's who suffered during COVID. I think we need to be moving to a world where people work in the formal sector and have minimum benefits associated with employment around unemployment insurance, pensions, and so on. At the moment, that is not the case for the vast majority of workers in the developing world. And then on opportunity, there is so much talent in the world today that is not being used and not being given a chance to thrive, particularly among women, and the fund has done a huge amount of work on this, but also children who are born into poor families who happen to be born in the wrong place to a poor family and are unable to thrive. There's been some very good work at the LSE on what we call lost Einsteins, children who have equal levels of skills, but happen to be born in a poor family. And if we could just give those lost Einsteins the opportunity that kids in richer families have, we could quadruple the rate of innovation in our economies and increase productivity. Look at what happened to productivity when women entered the labor force after World War II. You had a massive increase in productivity in countries where women increased their labor force participation. And that's where I think giving opportunity is beneficial to all of us, because then the pie will grow, and that is part of a new social contract. Giving opportunity to everyone is actually in all of our interests. That's what I think. Can I just add one more thing? The external investment really matters. And I think the fund has a really crucial role. Look at the difference between what Europe did, the European Union did when Eastern Europe transitioned. Europe provided a policy framework that they could attach themselves to. Europe provided financing to support that transition. When the Arab countries transitioned, Europe was in the midst of the Eurozone crisis and did not provide either the policy framework or the financing to facilitate the Arab countries in transition. I think now we have a moment. I know Kristalina has been pushing very hard to have the fund provide a more accommodative policy response as well as financing to help countries transition out of COVID. So the external actors are really important here to potentially make this transformation more successful.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Minouche. Kristalina?
I could not resist to follow up on what Minouche said, and actually other panelists, but specifically that we all have responsibilities. This is really all hands on deck moment. And so we have to think forward, not backward. One of my anxieties are around that notion that we are going to go back to normal. What we had was normal, but wasn't great. And so how we can move forward is the question we wrestle. And that involves three parts. The first one is to recognize that there is a very important role for governments. It is not about big government or small government. It is about good government that does the right thing for people. And that is a debate that is so very important at the moment. What does it mean to make sure that there is access to opportunities for all? What is the role of policymakers to set the right policies in place, but also to put their money where their mouth is? I remember, Minouche, in the old days when I had to teach market economics to Bulgarians who lived in a non-market society, I used a very simple example where the government should be and where it shouldn't be, saying, well, if it is service or benefit only to you as individual, you pay for it. Not much of a role for governments, but it is a service to you out of which society benefits, like education. There certainly has an obligation, not just a role for government. My haircut is my business, but my education is not entirely only my business. And I think we have to talk about discuss it, because it is not a clear-cut answer. It would depend in different societies, circumstances would be different, but we have to talk about it. The second very big issue, and of course the fund has to be clear on policy recommendations that are forward leaning, and there a big part is my second point. There will be shocks to come. So building resilience to shocks is something that becomes a ultimate goal of policymakers, but also it is a role for individuals and certainly for businesses. What does it mean? What is this concept of resilience? It is something that we all have to wrestle with, and how we get to it. What does it mean to have resilient people, resilient community, resilient cities, resilient countries? Of course, resilient planet, not to forget about it. And then comes the issue of social acceptance, and how we build that social acceptance in an era of information, misinformation, and straightforward lies. How we go about that, and how we get that notion of vibrant civil society, vibrant societies is great. Information is power for that vibrant society, and yet it is no more an easy river to swim in. And I would be very interested in this third aspect, what panel members think about it, and what advice you have for a technocratic institution that is in shock when straightforward lies are being spread that have no ground in either science or analysis, and yet we operate in that environment ourselves. Do we need to be more engaged at a local level? You know how we work. We are heavily centralized organization. Is that the way to be? Do we need to think of a different modus operandi of engaging with multiple partners? And so how do we do what we need to do? And Minouche, I'm absolutely with you. What I say about governments, put your money where your mouth is, absolutely applies to the fund.
Very much, Kristalina. You have asked specific question. Maybe let me ask Mauricio to answer this question and broaden it a bit. Social is clearly one of the keywords that has been used throughout this 45 minutes that we have been together. And social is also the responsibility of the states in order to enable access to opportunity and also to provide and support inclusion. Social spending, social support, we saw the role of the state becoming, in certain cases, overwhelming during the COVID-19 crisis. Going forward, and to answer what Kristalina has raised as important issues, how do you see the state playing a role here? How do you see social spending going forward? Alejandro and myself and others were faced in our work with the issues that many countries have high level of informality. Minouche mentioned the vulnerable groups, women and children, were the most affected during the COVID-19 crisis. What you would recommend to us from your experience and also from your research?
Well, thank you. And let me add to that question that Kristalina just posed, which is, what about the IMF? And what suggestions do we have for the IMF, which I think is very important? So my first point would be about this plurality of objectives, and there's a large number of fundamental rights. We don't know if after the pandemic we'll have to focus on education because of the losses in schooling, or in health because the need to prevent the future pandemic, or in climate because there is another crisis looming there. So there are many objectives. So we need to have better institutions to deal with these conflicts. We need to have institutions that solve conflicts in a peaceful way and in an effective way, because there are many, many objectives. And in my view, this points in the direction for those countries that are writing new constitutions or changing the institutions, the role of constitutional courts, the role of weighing in the different costs and benefits of different alternatives, but someone has to do that in a credible way. This is very important. And add to those rights, or the criteria to deal with those rights and fundamental rights, fiscal sustainability. This is what we did in Colombia. We incorporated into our constitution the right of fiscal sustainability, which is the right of future generations. And I think this is important because it allows a more balanced discussion between all these goals. That's point number one. Point number two, there is no way of coming out of this crisis and spending more on education or health or infrastructure if you don't have the resources to do that. You need the fiscal revenues to do that. You have to have that conversation. It's a very unpleasant conversation, but you have to have that conversation. Let me mention, in 2014, Colombia lost 50% of its export revenues and 20% of its fiscal revenues because of the loss in oil income. And of course, that generated a conversation in the country on what to do. Should we cut transfers to the poor? Should we cut spending on education? Should we cut spending on health? Or should we raise taxation? And the end result was an increase in the VAT and was an increase in the wealth tax to the wealthier Colombians. But that was a conversation, and people understood the trade-offs, and that was very, very important. I think we're in a moment like that now. We have to understand what the trade-offs are. If we don't do the right things, we may end up in a much worse situation. So that's where the IMF comes in. The IMF can help inform that conversation, not impose that conversation. Inform it, which means highlight the trade-offs. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. If you do that, this is what's going to happen. So countries are good at dealing with trade-offs once you explain them to the population. So this is also about communication. These are the alternatives. Let's choose what's the best alternative for us. And the alternative, the best alternative for Colombia is not necessarily going to be the best alternative for Brazil. But put forward a conversation in terms of what the options are and how to go about selecting between those options. That will be my advice.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. Let me ask the participants at this webinar if they have any questions. Please post them on the chat, and then I will direct them to the various speakers. Erik, let me go back to you and start with the question that where Mauricio ended. Where do you see the fund? You're someone who has been spending a lot of time with international and multilateral organizations. And two, you wrote a lot about productivity in Europe and how productivity is important. And we were discussing at some point in time the importance of building forward better, and technology, innovation, climate investment, increase in innovation, the new Einsteins. How do you see this new frontier in terms of bringing growth back and addressing the issue of productivity could help in the recovery post-COVID? Erik?
I think that's a pretty long agenda for some final remarks here. So I think I would focus on the point or the question that Kristalina asked, because I think that is a very important question. So I mentioned before, my many conversations with Masoud during the Arab awakening, and it was very difficult for him to do anything. He had a lot of good ideas for how to engage with civil society, how to bring in different parts of we remember long conversations in Cairo and in Tunis and so on, and he had a lot of things he wanted to do, but the fund at that point could not really get involved in these things. And I think the fund has come a very long way since then. I think the inclusion aspect that I mentioned before, and everyone has brought up, what really changed inclusion at EBRD and why it became such a game changer was that there was a way of looking at this, which people have talked about through the political economy argument for inclusion, that you want to bring people along and so. But the argument that really made a difference was the argument that Minouche was. It's about equality opportunity. It's an inequality opportunity is outright inefficiency. And for an institution that was created to promote efficiency in markets, transfer from state to market, and from authoritarian government to democracy, efficiency was critical. And by focusing on the efficiency argument, it managed to move the debate very quickly. And I think that's a lesson. I know that IMF has now very much is much more forthcoming when it comes to thinking about these issues. But I think that is a very strong argument for pushing the inclusion dimension. I mean, there are of course other very important issues around human rights and so on, but the efficiency argument seemed to work very well in these kind of organizations. What I'm also very encouraged about how the IMF has been able to work much fragile states and that in conflict environments, and I think the IMF has an incredibly important role in supporting these islands of stability of the central bank, of building a strong fiscal capacity of governments. I saw it in Ukraine, where the defense of IMF of the central bank and the willingness, I think that has been absolutely critical. And without it is not secure, I would argue, unfortunately, but it was incredibly important for a long time. And the other part, which was, I think, in a way, a novelty for IMF at the time, was to also look at the natural gas monopoly, Naftagaz, and really put that into the conditionality. And those two institutions have changed the name of the game, I think, in Ukraine, and IMF played an important role in that. So I think building islands, supporting state capacity. And let me finish with one thing, which I think is much more difficult for IMF and is difficult for other multilateral institutions, including the one that I'm now at. And it's a different dimension of inclusion, which I think it is part of Minouche's thinking, and it's part, but I think it's an overlooked part, which is inclusivity of in the process of shaping these reforms and these programs. And so this course that I'm teaching at the LSE at the moment is brought together a very experienced conflict mediator, negotiator, and my transition experience to try to get to how do we create processes that are inclusive and that where you create genuine ownership to reform programs. And so I think that's what often is missing. And I know it's very difficult for institutions from the outside to come into this. But here I would, in the sort of Mauricio's spirit of his remark, I would point to the opportunity to present different models how this has been done. So the Ukrainian model of the National Reform Council can play a role in a place like Tunisia, where they lack this kind of reform architecture. And to me, that's a role that we can play. Try to help countries think through how can we design processes that really involves all those powerful civil society organizations, like in the case of Tunisia, and how do we bring a genuine sense of ownership to this? Otherwise, we will not. The social contract has to be owned by those that are going to live by. Otherwise, it won't work. Thank you.
Erik, let me turn now quickly to Marwan and Minouche to answer the same question. What the fund and other partner institutions could do going forward to help countries dealing with those important transformation before giving the floor to Alejandro to conclude with the key takeaways of the discussion. Maybe Marwan and then Minouche.
Very quickly, I would list three things, Jihad. One, support Tunisia. I don't think the international community has supported Tunisia enough. And Tunisia is not going to, cost the international community a lot, but in supporting Tunisia, you are supporting a model that the rest of the Arab world can emulate. Support education. If there is one thing I need to emphasize, it is education in the Arab world, not in terms of building more schools, not in terms of putting computers in them, but in terms of the value system that is being taught at these schools. We need a value system that moves away from rote learning and into critical thinking and research and, these skills to deal with the complexities of the 21st century. And the third element, I would say, is talk more to civil society. I know the IMF is talking to civil society more now. I know when I was at the World Bank, we also were starting to talk to civil society. I would encourage more of that. You cannot leave it to governments only to show the way forward. You need to talk, if we are talking about inclusion, then we need also the international financial organizations also to walk the talk and talk more with civil society. These are the three areas that I would suggest.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Minouche.
I very much agree with.
If she has any recommendation to the fund.
I very much agree with what Marwan has said, and also Mauricio's point about delineating the trade-offs. The only thing I would add is that I think it's really important for the fund to show countries that exclusive economic systems are really inefficient. So rather than just banging on about inclusion, I think it's really important to show just how denying talented people opportunities is costing you. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I'd say is that providing minimum security for everyone is affordable. Providing a minimum health, the WHO minimum healthcare package, minimum cash transfers to the poorest households, and a decent level of education is affordable to every country in the world. Obviously, the level will vary depending on the country's per capita income, and as per capita income goes up, you can afford to do more, but a minimum level of security is affordable, and exclusive economic systems are incredibly inefficient and poorly performing.
Minouche, Kristalina, anything to add?
I was actually busy taking notes of what people were saying, especially towards the end, and I just want to recognize a point that came true. The fund has moved tremendously to be more open, but the world has also moved, and we have to strive to do even more. And to finish by saying very practical recommendations for us, including Minouche's on, don't just talk about inclusion and show pathways to inclusion, show the cost of exclusion. That was the last thing I wrote in my very rich stock taking from a great panel. Thank you.
Therefore, now, Alejandro, it's your very difficult mission to sum up a very rich discussion and to conclude this event.
Thanks, Jihad, and thanks all the panelists for such a rich discussion and such a deep discussion on how to change the fundamentals and the incentives for reform. That sometimes we focus too much on what Minouche called good ideas. We are enamored with our own good ideas, but then we don't think on how to generate the consensus for those ideas to actually give good results. As Kristalina said, let's not forget that before the pandemic, we were already in a place in which societies perceive their economic and political systems as providing unfair results, unfairness in terms of inclusion, of progressivity, and of equality of opportunities. And I think the pandemic, as it was shown by the surveys quoted by Minouche, basically provide a space in which there is a demand for more public goods and a little bit less individualistic view of our economic system. And in that sense, I think that heavily repeated quote by Napoleon when he told his valet while he was being dressed, "Dress me slowly that I'm in a hurry." I think it's a great quote because, as it was said in the panel, we need to search for a change in political power. We need to strengthen institutions, and we need to have good ideas. And that calls maybe for a consensus building process before jumping into just the implementation of what we think are the right policies. The speed at which the political system moves doesn't give us time to convince society on the results of our policies, because in 4 years, we will not see the results that will convince voters of a reform that maybe has not a strong political buy-in to begin with. So in that sense, focusing on these broad social consensus building processes that were discussed here, it's an important process that we need to think more deeply about. How do we generate these big social contract discussions in which all sectors of society see the reform process as basically building this new contract that benefits a huge majority of society, and not just pushing one reform that the current government thinks is the one that is going to push growth, improve distribution, etc., in the next few years. I think in that sense, the pandemic, so far, we have seen that it has generated more political polarization and antagonism, but hopefully it will provide a breakthrough event that will help politics to bring people together, to basically start the discussion of this new social contract. I will close with an example of an experience of the fund in Jamaica. The Jamaican authorities had a very successful program, but they also created something called EPOC, that it was the Economic Program Oversight Committee, where you have the unions, where you have the business sector, where you have universities, and where you have civil society. And basically, that fora also became a very important institution, so that the economic program was not seen only as a government or a party platform, but it was seen as a societal decision to move forward in all of these dimensions. So I think in that sense, hopefully at the end, now we have to focus on how to get out of the COVID crisis, how to correct some of the significant social gaps that COVID will leave us. But on top of that, we have the much larger challenge of basically starting the discussion of this new social contract that is needed in many emerging markets. Thanks, Jihad.
Alejandro, thank you very much. Both on your name and my name, I would like to thank the outstanding speakers. Thank also Kristalina for sharing their thoughts. I think it was an extremely interesting and yet sobering discussion on what needs to be done going forward. With that, I would like to again thank the speakers and wish you all the best. And also please stay safe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.